Hi guys, today we're going to go over setting up some different camera modes or behaviors. Obviously there are a lot of ways to set up a camera in a game, and the ones I'm covering today are more for 2D and especially top-down games. And essentially we're just going to go over the logic and code for a bunch of different modes and also write a script for switching between them. So I'm assuming you've already got a basic project set up, like a player character that you can control, maybe a tile set and a little world built into your room. And also probably just that you have got views enabled down here so that you've set up a little camera. We're not going to be using object following, we're going to be controlling the camera's position via code, so you don't have to worry about any of this. You can just say no objects for that one. Essentially, you just need a basic project like that set up. So the modes we're going to cover today are going to include just following an object. So for example, just this king object right here. The camera's position is just going to update every single step of the game or frame, and it's going to move itself relative to a particular object. So another mode that we're going to do is following the mouse's drag. So whenever we click and drag the mouse, the camera is also going to move. Another one is sort of pushing the camera when we have our mouse at a kind of border of the screen, so moving around like that. And obviously you can change how much that border area is going to give. Right, the next one is going to be moving to a particular target. And at the moment, I just have this set up to change whenever I click my mouse. So whenever I click right now, I'm telling it to move to that location. And this next one is just moving back to an object, and then it's going to proceed to just follow that object around. And finally, we've got this one I'm kind of going to call peeking out, because basically we're still mainly following the player, but we can kind of peek out a little bit using our mouse. So it's giving preference to the player object, but it is a sort of part way between the player and the mouse's position. So you might not want all of those in your game, and you might want to swap between some of them during, for example, cutscenes or something. So we're also going to make that script that allows us to change between modes and basically tell the camera to follow a new object or to go to a new location. Now, before we get started coding these modes individually, let's have a think about how we're going to set up the camera itself. I want the camera object itself to have access to all of the different modes. So somewhere in there, we're going to be storing all of the programming for all of the modes, but I only want it to do one at any particular time. And that's exactly what a state machine does, right? And a state machine is basically when we're going to have an object's behavior changing depending on what state it's in. If you're not very familiar with state machines, switch statements, or enumerators, I'd recommend watching one of my other tutorials on this topic because we're essentially going to be using the same logic here. Otherwise, let's move on. So let's come into our objects, create a new one. I'm just going to call this obj camera. And to start off with, let's come into its create event. And like I said before, we're going to need a variable that's going to keep track of what state or mode the camera is in. So let's make a variable mode, and I'll just set that to 0 for now. All right, let's come into the step event. And remember, so the step event is the one that's going to be called and performed every single step or frame of the game. So this is where we're going to want to put all of our camera behavior code. Now we basically want to say here, if mode is equal to a certain variable, then we want to have it perform certain code. And we can keep setting out if statements like this for all of the different modes. But another way we can do this is by using a switch statement. And that is going to look like this. So we go switch mode, and then we have our different cases. So for example, case follow object. And if you're not familiar with switch statements, this basically just asks, so depending on what mode is equal to, then we are going to check all our cases. So for example, in the case that mode is equal to the camera follow object mode, then we're going to do the code for that one. And in the case that it's equal to this one, then it will perform different code. And that's basically how we're going to set it out. So this ends up just being a little bit neater than writing a lot of if and else ifs, but essentially it's the same thing. So next, before we go any further, what I'm also going to do is I'm not going to use a string like this, right? So a string is just when we have these quotation marks here and then we have some kind of word in here, right? So this is a string, it's different to a real or a variable. So instead of using these, I'm actually going to come back to its create event and we're going to make an enumerator. And these essentially let us create our own little subtype of variables. So it goes like this. So we go enum. And then I'm going to call this cam mode. So this is where we're going to put all our camera modes. And then I'm going to list them like this. Follow object, follow mouse drag, follow mouse border, follow mouse peak, move to target, move to follow target, and that's it. So this is basically declaring a bunch of variables within the subtype enumerator cam mode, right? And if we were to actually use one of these, we would use it by saying cam mode dot follow object, and that would be using whatever we have set this to. And at the moment, we've actually just put commas everywhere, but we could actually set this equal to a number like that, or you could set it equal to a string. So now if I wrote cam mode dot follow mouse border, that would be exactly the same as if I had written this string right here. Or if I was accessing follow object, it would be the same as if I had just put 0. And if we just comma them like this, then it will actually just make them all equal to consecutive numbers starting from 0 with this variable. So follow object would be 0, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And for us, it doesn't really matter because I'm not really going to use these as proxies for numbers or any other variable. I just basically want a neat way of referring to different camera modes within our switch statement. And it's going to be especially useful because enumerators are actually global in scope. So unlike instance variables like this one right here, this one only exists within the camera object. If I was in another object, I wouldn't be able to access this variable right here. But enumerators I can access from outside of this object. And the reason this is handy is because if I'm changing the camera mode outside of the object and I'm running a script, change the camera mode to, and then I write cam mode, move to target, I can just write that. And it will still be able to access that variable from outside of this object. And even better, if you do write just cam mode dot, it's going to come up in the autocomplete. So again, if you're outside the object and you can't really remember what you've called the different camera modes, it will come up like this. So what all this means is we're going to actually set mode equal to one of these at a time. And remember, these just mean 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. So the fact that we've set it to 0 right now actually means that it's equal to follow object. So in our switch statement, which we're going to change to have our cases be the camera modes. So let's just write that in now. And don't forget to put your breaks, because basically if that case is going to execute, it's going to run all of the code that you put here until it finds a break statement. All right, let's just put all those in. Cam mode, follow mouse drag, cam mode, follow mouse border, follow mouse peak, move to target, and move to follow object. All right, so this one's not coming up, so maybe I've made a mistake in the enumerator. Yep, I've called it target instead of object. All right. All right, and just check all of your syntax is right. So you've got these on the ends and you have all your breaks. All right, good. Now we can get started with the actual code. So let's think about the following object one. So remember, the camera's position in our room, because it's anchored at the upper left corner, if we're following the object, then we're always going to have to correct for our position a little bit because we want the object to be in the center. So we're actually going to have to move the entire camera over half the width of the camera and then up half the height of the camera to get the object that we're following to be in the center. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to set up two variables up the very top, cx and cy, and these are going to be the camera's current position. So that's camera get view x of just that first camera there. So that's probably the one that you've set up in your room. So down here, so this means this is kind of camera 0. All right, and then same for the y. All right, so we've got the camera's x and y position. Then what we're going to do in all of this is we're going to change cx and cy to some new variable. And at the very bottom, we're going to camera set view pos. So this is going to set the camera's position to those new variables. All right, there we go. Now we are going to need to get the x and y position of the object that we're following, which also means that we need a variable to be pointing us to the actual object that we're following. So let's make a variable. I'm going to call this following, and I'm just going to set this to my object obj_king. You might want to set this to your player object. Let's come back. So let's go cx equal to the object that we're following's x position. But as I said before, we're now going to have to subtract half of the view so that we're getting our object in the center because the camera is anchored at the top left. And I'm also just going to put this in the create event because it's something that we only need to get once. So I'm just going to go view width, or you could call this camera width or whatever you want. So let's go camera get view width. Good, and let's do the same for the height. All right, so we've got the width and height, and now we can go minus view width over 2. And we'll do the same for the Y. And another thing you might want to do is just check that your object is actually existing before we do this. So we can go if instance exists following. So this is saying if an instance following does not exist, then we are going to break out of this case and we won't be performing this. So this is just in case maybe you're following an enemy or something and then it destroys itself, that your camera isn't just going to go and throw an error because this doesn't exist anymore. All right, so that's the first one done. And you'll find if you run the game right now and you just put the camera in your world, everything should work to just follow whatever object you've set here. Assuming you've also set your mode here to 0 or to follow object, which would just be like that. So let's just test that. Let's put a camera in and run the game. There we go, and let's move the player and it's working fine. All right, good. So moving on, let's do the, maybe we'll leave this one because it's a little bit harder. Let's do some of the other ones first. So let's go with the mouse border one, yeah. So what we're gonna do this time is, remember this was the one where we were sort of pushing at the edges of the screen, and if our mouse was at the edge of the screen, then we were gonna move the camera over. So we're gonna need something here that's checking if the mouse is within a certain, well, rectangle of the screen. And there is a nice function for this. It's called point in rectangle, right? So this takes in 2 points and then it checks, are those 2 points somewhere within this rectangle? Let's go mouse X, mouse Y, that's our 2 points. And now we have to write in what constraints we're placing. So we know that the very corner of the screen should be just the X and Y position of the camera. So we already have the very corner of the screen. So if we're starting from that corner, we want a little bit over probably. We want some buffer space between where we're pushing it. So I'm going to go CX plus view width times 0.1. So that's the width of the view times just 1/10 of it over. And I might just do the same for the Y. And then for the other side, so for the second X and Y part of the rectangle, so that was the top left one, now we're doing the bottom right one. So CX plus, and I'll just sort of do the inverse of what we just did, so times 0.9, view height times 0.9. All right. So now what we're actually checking is if the mouse is not in this region, so if it's not within this sort of region that we've set out where it's 10% into the screen, then we want to move the camera over. So we're checking if it's not within there, then we're going to move the camera over in the direction of where the mouse is. And to do this, I'm actually going to just use a lerp function. So this is linear interpolation. So if I just open that documentation page for you, so you can see, so this function is a little bit difficult to explain, but it makes more sense with an example. So basically you give it 2 values and then you give it a percentage, which is a number between 0 and 1. So if I give it 0, 10, and then I say 50% or 0.5, then it's going to interpolate these values by half and it will return 5, which is 50% of those values. So basically what it does is moves this value closer to the second value by some given amount, which is exactly what we want to do. So I'm going to move the camera value closer to the mouse X minus, of course, the view width over 2. Right, because we want the mouse's position relative to the center. So we're kind of pretending the mouse is further over than it is. And then I'm going to put a small number because I want this interpolation to be kind of slow. But if you wanted the camera to move faster when you're hitting the edge of the screen, then increase this number. And do the same for the Y. All right, so if we set mode to follow mouse border, we can have a look at what that looks like. So there we go. So once I've got my mouse close to the edge of the screen, it starts moving. And you can see at the moment, I can actually move completely out of the room. And you might want to actually put in something that clamps the camera's position so that we can't actually move outside the room. So I'll just show you what that would be. So you might actually want to set up a variable here called boundless, for example, because you might want to toggle this at certain points. So I'm just going to set this to false right now. So this means it isn't boundless, right? It's false. So we will be bound to the room. Sorry for that double negative. You might want to call it something else, but that's how I'm going to set it out. So down here, I'm just going to clamp the CX value of whatever we've worked out to be within the confines of the room. So I'm just going to check if it's not boundless. So this means we are bounded. We are not boundless. I'm going to clamp it. So we are going to clamp the camera value to be within a minimum and maximum. So we know we don't want the horizontal part of the camera to go any less than 0. So the minimum is going to be 0. That is the very start of your room. And then the end of your room will be room width. But again, because the camera is anchored at the left, we have to subtract its entire width because we want it to stop before any of the camera goes over the edge. All right, and we do the same for the Y. All right, so if we just run that again, then we should run into those boundaries. There we go, so I can't move outside the room. All right, good. So let's keep going. Now that we've done a little bit of the mouse and a little bit of the mouse border, let's do this peeking one. So remember, this one was where we were kind of following the player, but we were making the camera also take into consideration where the mouse was. So we're going to assume that we have set a following object variable already. And we're going to go CX equals, and just like before, we're going to use lerp. So I'm going to interpolate following.x to the mouse position. So this is what I was talking about. So we're going to have this variable and then the amount that we will interpolate it. So the amount we're going between these two variables will be whatever this percentage is here. And if I give it a lower value, then it's kind of going to preference this one. So we're going to stick closer to this one, but we are still going to move a little bit with the mouse. Right, and we do the same for the Y. Okay, but now we also have to subtract, again, just like all the other times, the view width and the view height. All right, and let's change mode. Now let's test that. There we go. Right, so we are moving with the king and we're sort of peeking over with our mouse. All right, good. And moving on to a target. All right, so this is going to be very similar to all of the other ones. So we need a couple more variables here. So a target X, and I'm just gonna set this to 200. Right, so we're just going to hope that when we run the game, we will appear at this exact location. So now in here, it's going to be quite similar to this one. So we can just copy that and paste it in here. But instead of following.x, we want target x. But if we did this, this is going to just pop the camera right to this location, which is not probably what you want it to do. You probably want it to slowly move over from where it is currently to eventually this location. So we don't want to make it just equal this straight up. Again, we are going to actually interpolate it using the lerp function. So we're going to say lerp. And again, depending on how big your game world is and how fast you want the camera to go, you might want to tweak this number, but I'm just going to go 0.1 and the same for the Y. All right. So let's make it equal to move to target and let's run the game. All right, good. So we started off, remember, at 0, 0. That's where the camera just starts off in your game. And we moved down to 200, 200. All right, good. Let's keep going. So move to follow object. Now this one was basically going to be to account for the problem that we saw here. And that's if I want to tell the camera to slowly go over to an object and then follow it, I don't want it to just pop right over to that object. So I'm going to grab this code here, and we're also going to check if the object is existing before we start to follow it. And instead of going to a target X and Y, we're going to following.x and following.y. And now the next thing I'm going to just check if point distance between the camera and this point here, basically the object's position. So if the distance between them is say less than 1, or you might want to put 2 or a higher number, because we are lerping to the player, the lerp function can actually go to very, very small numbers. And that's why we have to kind of check if it's less than 1. It's never really going to equal each other. So we have to just check if the distance between them is very small. Then I'm just going to say that we have reached it, and I'm going to just go change the mode to this one. Like that. All right. So let's change that to this one and run the game. So it should move to the king. Good. And then it should just follow the king as normal. All right, perfect. Now, last one is this mouse one. Now, this one is a little bit trickier. So basically, we only want the camera to move if I'm clicking, and then I want it to basically take into account, once I've clicked, how much I'm kind of moving the mouse, and then I want the camera to move accordingly. So let's check for that mouse click. So mouse check button, MB left, so it's the mouse left click. And now I basically want to be adding to the X and Y position of the camera. And the amount that I want to add is basically the difference between the mouse's position right now and the mouse's position on the previous step. Right, so I'm going to set up a variable, 2 variables, so mouse, X previous, and I'll just set this to -1 right now. Mouse, Y previous. Right, and we're going to use these in here. So what we're going to do first is we're going to get the current mouse position. So I'm just going to call this MX. And I'm not going to be using the mouse's position in the room. And the reason I'm not going to use it is because the mouse's position in the room on your screen is sort of going to change according to where the camera is. And this is a little hard to wrap your head around, but if you can imagine that if we just keep the mouse still on the screen, but we move the camera itself, then even though the mouse is still, it's actually going to be in a different position in the room, right? And you can imagine this as just sticking your hand on a chessboard or something. If you move the whole chessboard, your finger, despite not having moved, is going to end up on a different space on the board. And because of this is sort of going to make the camera jitter around if this is the anchor that we're using for the mouse. So I'm not going to use the mouse's position in the room. I'm going to use the mouse's position on the display itself. And that means if we are just putting our finger on the board and then we move the board, it's not going to matter. It's getting its position on the screen. All right, and we're doing the same for the Y. So now in here, what we're going to do is go mouse X previous minus MX, right? So whatever the mouse's position was previously, get the difference between them, and that's what we're going to add to the camera. Now, the only problem with this though is that the amount that your mouse is moving might be, if you're scaling your game up, a lot bigger than your game is. So you might find that if you move your mouse only a little bit, it'll move the camera a lot. So you might want to divide this by your scaling factor, or actually you might want to increase it if you're finding it moving too slow. I found that this was a little bit too quick for my scaling, so I'm just going to times that by 1/2, and I'll do the same for the Y. And then finally down here, what we're going to do is update this to be this. All right, good. Now let's change that and test it. All right, there we go. So all of our modes are working. Now we want to set up that script that is going to allow us to change between them. All right, so let's create a script. So let's come into scripts, create a new one, and I'm going to call this change camera mode. All right, so now if you haven't made a script yourself before, this is basically just a block of code that we can call from basically any other object and have it run this little self-contained script. And this is just the same as any function that you use in your game. And just like those ones have kind of little descriptions when you type them in and they tell you what arguments they need, we can do the same thing. And to do that, we just need to type @description, and this is the name of the script. Camera mode, so that's going to come up in the autocomplete. and then these are the arguments. So for this, I'm going to have a variable number of arguments. So we're going to have a mode, so that's telling us what to change it to, and then depending on what mode we're changing it to, we're going to need to tell it a few other things. So if I'm telling it to follow the dragging of the mouse, for example, I don't need to give it any more information than just the mode. But if I'm telling it to follow an object, then I need to tell it what that object is. Or if I'm telling it to move to a target location, I need to tell it the target. So let's put target X, target Y, and you could set up a fourth one for following, or you could just say following / target X. So this is just saying depending on what mode you're giving it, you can give it a different number of arguments. All right, so now in here, I'm going to go with the camera. So a with statement, if you haven't used one of these before, this kind of jumps into a different object and then it has it run this code. So if we were calling this whole script from within the player, it doesn't matter. The player isn't going to be running this code in here, it's the camera, right? Because we're in a with statement. Okay, so that also means we have access to the camera's variables and we can change its variables from within here. So I can say, change the camera mode to be whatever argument 0 is, and that's that one, right? Because the argument array starts at 0, right? Now, just like in our camera object itself, we're going to use a switch argument to decide what other variables to change. So in the case that we want it to move to a target, then we want to change its target X and target Y variables. So we're going to go argument 1 and argument 2, right? Because we would be putting in 2 arguments here. If we were doing just follow object, then we would be setting following to argument 1. That would be this one. Right? And actually the same goes for move to follow object. Right? And I can actually just leave it like this. I don't have to copy this and put it in here, because remember what I said before, if you don't put a break, then it's just going to keep executing the code. So if this case is true, then it's actually going to go ahead and run this. Right? And we actually don't need to do any other ones because for all of the mouse ones, we don't have to update any of the other variables. All right, so for example, if I come into the king object and I just have, let's say I hit space, I'm going to change camera mode. So let's go cam mode dot move to follow object, and let's say ourselves. Right, so if I hit the space button, then I'm going to change the camera mode to follow the king object. And then let's say if I hit the left mouse button, I'm going to change camera mode to cam mode dot follow mouse drag. And I don't need to put any more arguments. Right. And you can try all of them if you want, just to test that they're all working in this script. But I'll just run those 2. So let's hit the space button, and we can see that it goes and it follows the player. And if I hit the mouse button, it's going to let me drag the mouse. All right, cool. So there we go. That's it for today, guys. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who's supporting me on Patreon to make these tutorials. And special shoutouts to Semimyth, Cursed Toast, Danielle Hargrave, Doan Tegman, Bartolomé Lisfon, XD Game Studio, Vasco, Umberto Gonzalez, Hunter T, Ian Seckington, Shake Bunny, The Great Poultry, Thomas M, Max Molinaro, Monju72, Moo Podcasts, Mistara, Ricky C, Spock 2018, and Semi-Metal Alchemist. I hope you guys are all well, and I'll see you in the next video.